Thank you, Jerry. I'm very pleased to be here, and I appreciate the invitation and welcome. Chicago is a part of today's lecture, but I wanted to do something a little more surprising, and so we're going to talk about some historic church architecture. And what I want to do is ask you to join me in the time machine as we travel back magically to the year 1962. 1962. A year in which a new emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was crowned. His name was Otto I. Emperor Otto came to the throne of the Holy Roman Empire at a time when the bishops attached to the court were very upset because the idea had occurred to them that the world was going to end in the year 1000. Now, some of you, I'm sure, are old enough to remember the turn of this last millennium and how there was a great deal of fear regarding our computer systems failing. And we referred to this as the fear of Y2K. I'm taking us back to the fear of Y1K. The fear of Y1K. And without much surprise, and of course, given the importance of the church in the medieval European world, it's no surprise that Emperor Otto's response to this situation was to engage in a program of construction on a massive scale of new churches to make sure that the people were ready for the second coming of Christ, that we should get holy in time for this miraculous event at the end of the world. So here in my first slide, we have Emperor Otto himself. He is one of the smallest figures in the image. He is holding in his hands Magdeburg Cathedral in Germany. He is being shepherded into the presence of Christ on a throne, where Christ is touching the church to bless it, as St. Peter looks on, holding his keys on the right. This this is a plaque carved in ivory, and it was made around the year 970. And represents the kind of work that Otto engaged in. What is happening here is they are designing new buildings that are going to contain relics to increase the attendance and to magnify and enhance the spiritual experience for the audiences who are coming to these buildings. This is St. Michael's, a church in Hildesheim, Germany. This is the cross-section and plan. And these buildings were built in a way that imitated the early Christian churches of the 4th and 5th centuries that we still see standing in places like Rome. A view of St. Michael's Church gives you a sense of the height of the building. And of course, these churches were almost always built on the highest point in the town. Literally, the towers were signs that could be seen from as much as 15 or 18 miles away. This is where the relics are kept. And actually, it's buildings like this that give us the name landmark. They are so tall, and they mark the land as mark a holy, sacred site in the landscape, and therefore, literally, landmark. Yeah. The pastor of this church became Bishop Bernard, and the bishop traveled to Rome. And while he was there, he saw that ancient Roman early Christian churches had doors that were made of bronze. And in Germany at the time, the habit was to have wooden doors, but that were carved with scenes of usually New Testament, but sometimes Old Testament themes. When Bishop Bernard saw the bronze doors, he said, well, I'm going to combine these two traditions, and I'm going to make a series of sculptural images and then cast them in bronze. These are the first bronze doors that carry images and narratives of biblical stories. My favorite, we've got, by the way, on the left side, starting at the top, creation, and moving down the left door to the bottom, the fall from grace and expulsion from Eden. On the right, the Annunciation and the New Testament story that leads to the resurrection at the top. And my favorite, I'll confess, is this panel, wherein God has discovered that Adam and Eve have been nibbling apples. And God on his tiptoes is looking, I think the word is peeved. And he's pointing at Adam, and Adam, in the tradition of I suppose I would have to say spineless people, covers himself with his left hand while pointing with his right at Eve, who, of course, points at the serpent, and the serpent looks up and says, ah, cha-cha-cha-cha. Now, the problem with these buildings that the emperor is building and he's proliferating across the landscape is that, just like the early Christian churches, they have stone walls but wooden roofs. Now, if you're going to build a very tall building with towers that stick up on the highest spot in the town, you may think you're building a church, but you're also building a lightning rod. These buildings were often hit by lightning, and of course, the contents are rare, they are precious, and they are fragile. We have Bibles, hand-written manuscripts with beautiful paintings. We have the Psalms. We have, of course, the relics. And the relics typically are bone or cloth or occasionally wood. These are all materials that will burn. And so what we've got to do is we've got to protect the contents of these churches, and we have to become innovative about the architecture we're going to build in order to do this. Now, what Otto I started, his son, conveniently enough named Otto II, continued. And so this leads us all the way up to the end of the 10th century, the year 1000. And by that time, a new habit was getting started. People were beginning to travel. They were beginning to travel to see and visit and engage in veneration in front of the relics in so many churches across southern France and into northern Spain, the ultimate goal being the Church of Santiago de Compostela, the Church of the Apostle St. James, in the far northwest corner of Spain. And of course, this is a time when Spain is roughly split in half, the southern half under Muslim rule, the northern half under Catholic rule, and the battles are ongoing, and St. James is the patron saint of Spain and the patron saint of this war to reclaim the rest of the Iberian Peninsula in the name of Christendom. Which route you chose to follow on the pilgrimage route might have had something to do with where you were starting, but it also had something to do with which churches you wanted to visit along the way. Which saints' relics did you want to visit? Which ones were relevant to your life and your family? Because certain saints, of course, if you're a musician, you want to visit the Church of St. Barbara because she is the patron of musicians, right? So we need to travel. And of course, many of us are no doubt familiar with Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Of course, these were stories being told on the road as we were traveling. And we were going from town to town. And these towns are conveniently enough located one day's travel each from the next, so that we can get to the next town in the space of one day's travel. Now, the distances change greatly because in some places the land is rather flat and easy travel is relatively easy. We can go a greater distance. But in some places, for example, going through the Pyrenees, and these are people actually walking on the medieval pilgrimage path, it's pretty rough. And of course, the goal is to be in touch with the wonderful relics in the various churches throughout southern France and into northern Spain. So the problem we have is a problem of architecture. How do we preserve these wonderful and precious objects from the threat of lightning? We have to get rid of the wood frame roof like this. And of course, the answer is to create a stone vault that is fireproof like this. This is the invention of what comes to be known as Romanesque architecture, with the rounded arches and the barrel vaults that are perfectly fireproof. Now, there is a wooden roof on top of this to keep the rain and the snow off of the stone so we don't have erosion, and that part could burn off. But the thing is, the stone provides an insulation and it protects the interior of the church, and it's a very easy matter to replace the wooden frame on the roof. So what we have then is an opportunity to understand that while they're tall and they may act as lightning rods, These are buildings that are now protected in and of themselves, and they are protecting the contents within them. Now, the people of these towns eagerly built these buildings, even though they were much more expensive and much more labor intensive, because they knew that this kind of veneration was so important to them and to the people coming to visit. We can sympathize as Chicagoans with this point of view. We understand the threat of fire because, well, we've lived through it. Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over the lantern on October 8th, 1871. It happened in a barn full of hay, and the barn windows were open, and the wind was blowing 22 miles an hour out of the southwest, and the burning hay caught fire and was picked up by that wind and carried out those windows, and the neighboring buildings all caught fire, and of course they were stables full of hay as well. Within an hour, 12 square blocks of the south side was on fire. Within 4 hours, people in the middle of the night are grabbing their possessions, putting them on their backs, and running for their lives. We thought we built a city in the early days of Chicago, but we didn't. We built a bonfire. Most of Chicago was built of wood in those days, and we had the driest, hottest summer anyone could remember in 1871. It rained on July 3rd and did not rain again. All of July, all of August, all of September, and into October, and then this happens. We didn't have a professional fire department at the time. We had an amateur fire department. They had fought another fire that morning before the wind blew up, and they'd gone home to bed. Bad timing there. We have records of people only having one route of escape. They jumped in the lake. There are oral histories at our history museum of people telling us how they stood chest deep in the water. How many of you like to go swimming in October? Standing chest deep in the lake in October for 3 days until finally it rained and put the fire out. It must have been, as this print shows us, quite an amazingly dramatic scene. Chicago is one of America's youngest big cities. In the U.S. Census taken in 1830, the civilian population of Chicago is counted as 28. We've got more than that in this room. We may have twice as many of that in this room. 28 civilians in Chicago in 1830. By 1900, we are nearly 2 million. That means in 70 years, one lifetime, we went from 28 to 2 million. We are the fastest growing city in the world. And what did we do right in the middle? This. If you're the fastest growing city in the world and you burn the whole place down, you had better get inventive about how you're going to rebuild your city. This is the reason why Chicago is the capital of architecture, not just in North America, but in the entire Western Hemisphere. We had to reinvent architecture because of the pressures of growth and the fear of another fire. This is the map of the fire district. The fire started at the bottom of the slide, which is a half a block north of Roosevelt Road. It burned and crossed the river, then it burned the entire loop, then it crossed the main branch of the river and burned the north side, and it didn't stop until it ran out of things to burn at Fullerton Avenue. A distance of 6 miles in length and over a mile in width. 130,000 people were homeless on the eve of a Chicago winter. New York sent us food. Boston sent us blankets. Philadelphia sent us medicine. The newspaper in St. Louis has a banner headline, "Chicago burns to the ground, St. Louis to be the greatest city of the Midwest." There's a reason Cub fans don't like Cardinal fans. And what do we have but the Queen of England hears of our fire, and she sends, Victoria sends a letter to our mayor. "Dear Mr. Mayor, I'm so sorry to hear of your fire. I'm sure you lost your public library. I'm sending 5,000 books in crates that should be arriving shortly so that you can restock your library. Thanks, Your Majesty, we never had a library before." But we do now. And if you go to the Harold Washington Library, some 960 of those books with Queen Victoria's seal in the cover are still in the collection. What a wonderful thing. They're non-circulating today. They're in the rare books collection on the first floor. So in Chicago, we had to invent an architecture that wouldn't burn. And the way we did this was, of course, we used new technology. This is just what they did in the Middle Ages. It was a new technology to build a stone vaulted roof to protect the precious objects in these pilgrimage churches. And we built a new architecture of fireproof construction using steel for beams and girders, but covering all of that with fireproof material. In the 19th century, up to about the 1930s, we used terracotta. Today, of course, we use concrete. It's really like the construction of your arm. There are bones in here. That's the steel. It's wrapped with muscle. That's the terracotta. Then we got a skin on the outside to protect all of it. And usually that was brick or more ornamental terracotta. Yeah? And so that's the way we built. And we created these enormous framed buildings. And the big difference here, of course, is that instead of building stone on stone on stone on stone, we build the frame and we put the building on the frame and we hang the building from the frame. Imagine the L structure just a block away. We could take the tracks and we could hang walls of glass right from the track level down to the street. And we could do that down the entire length of the L. We could build the longest building in the world. It would be an entire corridor of space. Yeah? This is how modern buildings work. They hang from the top down. This is why we have the term curtain wall. And it's why modern architecture looks so different than historic architecture, and why the scale of it can be so much greater. Well, here's an excellent comparison between what was going on in the Middle Ages and what's happened in Chicago. And of course, Otto II is going to continue developing this medieval architecture for the church. Here we have Christ crowning Otto and his wife Theodora as Otto II and his wife Theodora as emperor and empress. And it's during this time that towns like Vézelay in France are being developed. If you're a pilgrim walking along, this is the view you get of Vézelay as you're approaching the city. But of course, it's much more easily understood if we have an aerial view, where you can clearly see there's one major avenue, and all of the businesses that are hoping to engage the pilgrims are crowded right up on the street. The first three rules of location, they still apply. Location, location, location. The best hotels and restaurants are closest to the cathedral, and look where the cathedral is, on the top of the hill. And as soon as we leave, as soon as we have visited that building, and we have prayed, and we have maybe left a donation, we leave the building and we've left the town. The town is over. There is nothing beyond the cathedral, because now we're on our way to the next town, a one day's travel. And this is the way it works. When we approach the front of the building, we're greeted by sculpture that reminds us of Scripture. Might even remind us of the experience we're going through as pilgrims. Here's a wonderful little sculpture that shows the three kings. They napped during the day. The star has come up over Bethlehem. The angel is poking them. Hey, sunset, let's go, fellas. They're on pilgrimage, no different than the people visiting the church are on pilgrimage. And of course, as they're traveling, they're receiving blessings. And sometimes they're getting a little bit of excitement when we see images like Christ at the Last Judgment, where on his right the holy are praying, but they aren't nearly as interesting as those on his left, where we see angels and demons weighing souls. The demons look particularly nightmarish and ghoulish here. I don't know, maybe it's a zombie apocalypse. And so we build these buildings. They have lost their wooden roofs. They have been replaced by a stone roof. And these roofs are going to get taller and taller and taller to the point where we're going to have to add these support structures that you see here in brown that will help push up that arch and keep it high and enable us to build ever higher. And these, of course, are the flying buttresses. So as we go along, this impulse to reinforce religious faith has had this incredible impact that it's a snowball rolling down the mountain, getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it is increasing the scale of these buildings, increasing the numbers of pilgrims who can visit them, and can bring us to a building like this one. This is the Church of Saint Foy in the French city of Caen. Well, it's not a city, it's a town of Caen, and it is the repository of the relics of Saint Foy, the patron saint of prisoners of war. And of course, if we have a family member who has been captured in battle, this is one of the churches we want to stop and see on our travel. Yeah? We make a big enough donation, we're allowed to climb the stairs behind the altar, wrap our arms around the back of the sculpture, and whisper our prayer into the ear of the reliquary. What a powerful thing to do. How often in faith do we get to actually physically engage with someone we know is in heaven right now? It's a very powerful thing. Otto II is followed by his son, and conveniently enough, he is Otto III. This is why we call this the Ottonian Period. Well, of course we do. And what we have then is churches that continue to expand in scale. This is the Church of Saint Sernin in the southern French city of Toulouse. By the time they build this building, around the year 1060, the interior is designed for pilgrimage on a continuous basis. You'll notice that we have two aisles running up the right side. Our pilgrims will enter the church and go up the right aisles. Services are being held in the middle, in the nave, but the side aisles are literally ambulatories. People are walking around, and they walk around, and they get to the back, and you see these several radiating chapels, each one containing relics, each one offering the opportunity for veneration, each one reinforcing and creating a crescendo of religious experiences and fervor, and then the denouement as we wander out the aisles on the left side, only to be confronted by the gift shop before we leave. Absolutely. Now, all of these people on pilgrimage, they're having these experiences, but we have to remember they're traveling great distances. It required that you take 3 or 4 months out of your life to go do this. And having done it, of course, one has to go from town to town to town. And in these towns, people realized the visitors need a place to stay. I have an extra bedroom. I'll open my home. Oh, wait. Maybe I should name it Airbnb. No. I'm going to open my home, and I am going to host visitors, and they are going to be able to stay in my home because they'll need a place to sleep. And of course, this evolves into a new building type full of sleeping rooms, originally known as the hostel. Well, of course, somehow in the French culture in the 16th century, the French decided they did not like the sound of the letter S. It just grated on the French ears. So S's just started disappearing everywhere. And from hostel, we get hotel because the S disappears. Another industry that has to be created, these people have traveled all day, and it's very rough travel. When they get to a town like this, the first thing they think of after checking into a room is finding a meal. And in the lexicon of these days, it was called restoring your strength. I'm not going out to dinner, I'm going to restore myself. And of course, restore in French is spelled R-E-S-T-A-U-R. And this is where the word restaurant comes from, the place where we restore our strength before we travel again tomorrow. The third industry we have to create for a town like this, surrounding one of these great pilgrimage churches, literally has to do with the fact that I have been here. Today, the kids go to a concert, they got to have the t-shirt. I was there. And the word I was there in French is souvenir. We have to invent the souvenir. Isn't that nice? I mean, I can't even make this stuff up. You gotta love it. Souvenir, the souvenir, I have been there. And of course, in those days, they were always medallions with the image of the saint. And so you could carry the image of the saint and the memory of the interaction with the relic with you. It was experiential on a whole different level. Now, when I speak to my students these days about these kinds of experiences, of course, we've all gone on family vacations. As we've traveled, we've stopped in restaurants, we've stayed in hotels. And when I ask them what kind of pilgrimage they've gone on, the one that comes across most often is this one, where the interaction is of a very different kind. And embracing the relic, well, is sometimes fuzzy. Nonetheless, the parallel exists, and it certainly is an interesting parallel because, of course, we can understand that for the 7-year-old today, one of the most important parts of that vacation is going to be the moment when they see the character whom they identify with most. Whether that is a little girl who identifies with Cinderella or one of the other princesses, or they identify with Mickey or Minnie, but never Goofy. No, not Goofy. When we finally reach Compostela and we come over that last hill, this is the view we see of the church dedicated to St. James the Apostle. It does not look today as it did in the Middle Ages because, of course, the Spanish found so much wealth in the New World when they came here, and they spent some of that wealth putting all kinds of decorative icing on the cake that is the 11th and 12th century building dedicated to the Apostle James. We are blessed as we come through the door. Christ welcomes us right over the entrance, and when we go inside, well, we see this fireproof building of the same type that we've been encountering all along the pilgrimage route. And when we get to the high altar, we find that the altar is also the repository of the relics of the saint. He is shown in sculptural form sitting on the altar, and there is a staircase. You can see the railing on the right, where we can climb the stairs, go behind the statue of the saint, and once again, embrace him and whisper our prayer into his ear. What a wonderful gesture. What a wonderful way to go. In Chicago, we had no idea what inventing a new fireproof architecture would do in terms of the unintended consequences of the way it would impact the future. If we look at buildings under construction from the end of the 19th century, and we see how this new technique of construction and installation of the walls and the fireproofing activity allows us to develop an entirely new building form like the department store. My students refer to this today, by the way, as Carson Pirie Target. Here it is under construction, a photograph taken in 1901, and of course the more familiar view we have of it. But everywhere we look, it is coated with this fireproof material that also carries the beauty of the ornament. Just as we had that kind of inspiration in the late 19th century, it has led to ever more expressive and dynamic and unique building forms, like Marina City with its exceptional balconies, like Jean Gang's wonderful Aqua Tower from only a few years ago. These are the kinds of unintended consequences of building, starting from the premise of a simple fireproof building form. Likewise, in the Middle Ages, we start with this fireproof building form, and what they've done is they've evolved even further the building form so that it could be lighter, so that it could be thinner, but it could still be just as effective as a fireproofing agent. We invented the ribbed vault, the first one appearing at the Church of Saint-Denis, the Royal Church of the House of France, the church in which the kings of France for hundreds of years were crowned in suburban Paris. And laying on the floor and looking up at this construction, what it really looks like is the toes of the foot of a duck with the skin between the toes. The bones are in the ribs, but what's between those ribs is a thin veneer of stone that still provides the same fireproofing that the old heavy arches provided. And this creates an entirely new flexibility in architectural design. The fervent faith doesn't change, but the architectural form evolves in such a way that all of a sudden it evolves into a form we know as the Gothic, where the buildings can be even taller, but now the combination of these ribbed vaults and the flying buttresses allow for the walls to be opened up and for windows to be put in on a grand scale. And so we see the flying buttresses marching down the side of Notre Dame in Paris. And we see that between those ribs there are enormous panels of glass, the largest of which is the one over the south portal here. And of course, these are always dedicated to Notre Dame, Our Lady. There was an ecumenical council that was held not long before this building was built. One of the questions they addressed was, do women have souls? Ladies, you might have been in a whole lot of trouble. There's a room full of men making decisions about whether or not you have souls. Most of them are celibate, by the way. It might not have gone your way. But what happened was the memory of Mary's role. Father did a wonderful job in the benediction today reminding us of her role. And her role as a human woman who brought divinity into our world. This proves, of course, beyond a shadow of doubt, that female human beings indeed have souls, and that men had better acknowledge it and take better care in the way they address them and interact with them. This is the birth of chivalry. And this is such an important moment in the history of both church and culture that all of the medieval churches after this ecumenical council, almost all of them, they're no longer dedicated to the different saints like Saint Foy or Saint Sernin. They're all now dedicated to Notre Dame. When we speak of the Gothic cathedrals, we never say the name of the cathedral. We always say the city. Because we'd be saying Notre Dame, and you'd say which one? Notre Dame in Chartres, Notre Dame in Rheims, Notre Dame in Rouen, Notre Dame in Paris. Of course, when we think of Notre Dame today, we think of Paris. But they're all named for Our Lady. And of course, she is symbolized by this incredible window. She is symbolized by this massive structure that occupies an entire wall. This is the rose window, the rose of heaven. The rose window that on the outside is such a beautiful pattern, and on the inside is such an inspiration. Well, yes, indeed. Yes, indeed it is. And yet all this starts from the fear of Y1K. When we ask the question of unintended circumstances, well, here we have wonderful results, and here we have an opportunity to say, the architecture truly does respond to the needs of the people and, of course, to the needs of faith.
Before the days of cranes,
Yes.
it must have been interesting trying to lift
Yes.
loads up story by story to the top of...
Yeah, it was truly difficult. There were many routines. For those of you who may not have heard, he's asking about before cranes, how do we get all this material so high up in the air? And literally, it became too heavy for people to carry and climb all those stairs, right? So all kinds of techniques were experimented with. Using oxen to pull ropes over pulleys to bring things up stages was one of the successful ways to do this. Primitive kind of what we would call dumbwaiters were also developed. But this was one of the reasons why when you read about some of the medieval cathedrals, it says, oh, it took them 200 years to build it. Well, here's one of the reasons why. Because it literally was muscle power, whether it was human muscle power or animal muscle power. Either way, the only way to defy gravity was to tote that barge and lift that bale, and it was really quite an amazing effort. So when when we look at these buildings, we have it pretty easy. We get on an elevator and push a button, and it takes us up 7 stories to this wonderful Luncheon. But historically, everybody had to climb those 7 stories. And actually, one of the interesting things about architecture in Chicago is the way that in the 19th century, before the elevator, the cheapest space, whether you were living in it or using it for business purposes, the cheapest space was on the top floor of any building. Because, of course, when you came down to go to lunch, and then you said, "Where's my phone?" you remembered why you paid the cheapest rent, because you had to climb the largest number of stairs. And, of course, today, our architectural situation, our real estate situation with regard to tall buildings is exactly 180 degrees opposite. Because today, the most valuable space is, in fact, a space that has acquired a very special name, the penthouse. Yeah. So technology has completely flipped the most important spaces in our buildings from the bottom to the top. Yes, sir?
Could you comment, I'm not sure if it's a quick one, but the role of the crucifix in architecture in churches, particularly inside, but there seems to be different approaches amongst churches about where the crucifix is located.
It's really interesting because the habit of serving Mass changed. So the symbols have to be moved around. Today, Mass is served in such a way as the celebrant faces the audience and stands on the far side of the altar while preparing the Holy Meal. And this was actually the way it was done in the Middle Ages. But during the late 1300s or early 1400s, and I don't have the date specifically in my mind, they turned it around and they pushed the altar against the wall, and the idea was supposed to be that the priest was leading the congregation toward the altar, and of course when the cup or the bread were raised, they were raising it, and that created the opportunity for a focal point for artwork, sometimes in sculpture, often in painting. The surprise is, before the Protestant Reformation, there are not nearly as many crucifixes as there are afterward. This has everything to do with the Counter-Reformation and the use of the cross with the crucified Christ on it by Catholics, and the cross bare without the crucified Christ in Protestantism. So when we look at medieval art, we much more often see Christ enthroned in heaven. We see Christ with his mother, Madonna and Child. We see images like these, but we don't see as anywhere near as often. It's not that it's not there, but it's not as often seen as the crucifixion. Another thing that's fascinating about that is if you look at the crucifixion from, say, the 1100s up to about 1220, you get this figure who is not in pain, who's looking at you. I'm doing this for you. What are you doing for me? Kind of thing. It's godlike. He's above the pain and not human. But then along came Saint Francis of Assisi, and after Saint Francis, Christ's body sags on the cross and turns and winces in pain, and all of a sudden we see the blood coming from the wounds. And it humanizes the image of the crucifixion. And that's actually one of the bigger changes that occurs in medieval art is the movement from an antiseptic, no blood, nails through the hands kind of thing, with kind of a almost art historians often refer to it as the accusatory stare. I'm doing this for you. What are you doing for me? And St. Francis is really an amazing dividing line, because after him we see a much more human Christ, a Christ who sympathizes with the pain we might experience in this life on earth. Yeah. Yeah.
So in Chicago, churches that were spared the fire, maybe on the periphery, did they immediately start to rethink or reclad their buildings to spare them, or?
Well, Catholic churches of the 19th century were typically built of masonry anyway. Among the public buildings of Chicago, For example, the outer walls of the cathedral, Holy Name, those date back to 1854. So what happened to the cathedral was the outer walls survived and the center burned out. So they had to rebuild the upper parts of the walls and put a new roof back on it. But that church has pre-fire walls up about to the tops of the pointed arches on the sides. Yeah, much of the facade is also pre-fire. The Catholic cathedral has been kind of altered pretty radically over the years. It's been rebuilt several times on the interior. Once back in the 20s, once during the 60s during Vatican II, and then again recently. So if you go to that building, you won't see much on the interior that tells you about the historic cathedral. If, however, you wander only a block away to the Episcopal Cathedral, that building has been restored to its mid-19th or late 19th century character in a national award-winning historic preservation project. You can get a real flavor for the kind of interior that the Catholic Cathedral had by looking at the Episcopal Cathedral, St. James, just a block away at Huron and Wabash. While you're there, if you do go visit, keep in mind it's the only surviving Lincoln site in Chicago.